and saying, okay, are we going to need 1,000 bottles, or are we going to need 10,000 bottles, or in some cases with some of the huge brands, 100,000 bottles,
Right.
and then
Right.
that would translate into, do the math. You need 100,000 corks, but also doing your job, and following up and making sure that the distributor, for example, when we had to change all of our pricing because of the tariffs, you need to get that pricing to the distributor in a timely fashion.
Welcome to Manufacturing Insiders. Today I have John Flynn with me. He is in a little bit of a unique kind of segment of manufacturing, one we haven't dove too much into, but he's in the wine business. And a lot of times people don't really think of winemaking as manufacturing, but it really is. And I think that there's some cool lessons that we can learn from the wine business. So some of the things that I want to talk about today is kind of the use of storytelling and branding in marketing, which is relative to every type of manufacturing. And I think it's something that we all can do a better job of, of incorporating that into our messaging. But welcome to Manufacturing Insiders, John. Looking forward to hearing some insights from you.
Thanks so much, Nate. Great to be here.
So, in my understanding, Zonin1821 they do business in Italy, so they take Italian wines and bring them to the U.S. and probably other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, they export wines to, I believe it's 140 countries around the world, which is quite significant.
Wow.
They have 10 estates all over key wine growing regions in Italy.
Yep.
So we're most well known for our Prosecco, which is
Okay.
up in the northeast part of Italy. And we also have a wonderful estate in Tuscany called Castello di Albola. We have an estate in Piedmont called Castello di Poggio. We have a great Pinot Grigio from Friuli called Cabellani. So, one of the things, if I can just jump right in when you talk about manufacturing, and in particular for wine, a big piece of it, it's not exactly manufacturing, but it's a key component, is the transportation of all those products. Right. So you have 10 estates from different regions, around Italy, and you've kind of got to bring all those products together to ship them to those 140 countries around the world, and in particular the United States. So when a distributor here orders an order from Italy, they want to fill the container as much as possible. That's also a key component of costing. The more cases you can fit on that container, the less it's going to cost you per case, which then that will be passed on to the distributor, which will then be passed on to the consumer. So that's a very, very crucial piece of the puzzle is the transportation aspect of it. And when you talk about the manufacturing, the manufacturing of wine is, first off, you start with the vineyard. And you're basically manufacturing wine from grapes, okay, essentially. They call it winemaking instead. And then you have to bottle that product. You have to produce the bottles. You have to produce the labels. You have to produce or source the labels or the bottles, the corks, the capsules, the boxes, what we call dry goods. All those types of packaging are crucial to the success of transporting the final product, which is actually when you're sitting in your kitchen and you're getting ready to have dinner and you pop the cork on a bottle of wine. There's a lot of things in that production process and that manufacturing process that could go wrong. Right. You could have a problem with the grapes, you could have a problem with the corks, you could have a problem with the bottles. So I think the really, so many people give credit to the winemakers. They get all the glory. But to me, I've always been fascinated about the logistics and, the people that source all the dry goods and design the labels. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. So all those things that are not as sexy are, in many cases, just as important as the actual winemaking process.
So, with regards to the logistics, if there's if there's one thing that you feel the wine industry does really really well, that could be maybe a takeaway for other types of manufacturers. What would that be?
Well, I would say something that's enormously important is you have obviously with wines there's many different types of wine, different price points, different production levels. So when you're talking specifically about production, it's a lot of times, doing projections and saying, okay, are we going to need 1,000 bottles, or are we going to need 10,000 bottles, or in some cases with some of the huge brands, 100,000 bottles,
Right,
and then
right,
that would translate into, do the math. You need 100,000 corks, and then you need, 10,000 boxes for the cases, and um, so all those projections are enormously important when it comes to the manufacturing because of scalability. If you go to, let's say, a bottle manufacturer and you want to order 10,000 bottles, you're probably going to get a better price if you order 250,000 bottles.
right.
So, and you have to have the projections, you have to have the marketing strategy, you have to have the pipeline, the distribution networks. All those things have to be set up in order for your projections on your production then leads to the production of all those other components.
Right. I guess one advantage that wine might have, if you do mess up those projections, like even in terms of like the initial manufacture of the product, you can always just sell it later. And you might be able to get a better price later for it because it's more aged wine. Is that right?
No. No, nobody wants to get into that situation. Well, so think of it this way. Wine, certainly fine wine, is very vintage specific.
Mm-hmm.
White wines, certainly for the 90% of white wines, do not age particularly well. They don't get better. They're consumed. They're much better consumed early in their life. I mean, if you want to talk about the ultra luxury brands, that may change, but for the vast majority of brands out there, when they're released, they're ready to drink. I think I read an article a few years back that 80% of all wine purchased is consumed within a week of the purchase. So people
Unbelievable.
tend to shop and go home, and they might be at the supermarket and they're cooking, let's say steaks for dinner or something. Oh, I need a bottle of red wine, and oh, tonight's our anniversary, so I'm going to get something a little bit more special or something like
Right.
that. So there's so many um, decisions that go into. You and I were talking right before broadcast about the importance of labeling, and it's a very well known fact that 70% of wine is purchased by women, and women disproportionately. Okay, this is not painting too much with a wide brush, but women really respond to packaging. And I've seen it happen 1,000 times where there'll be two wines that will be similar in price and similar varietal. Maybe there'll be two Chardonnays or what have you, and they'll be the same price. And the consumer, not always a woman, but many times it will say, "Oh, I really love that label," and there they go.
Yep. Yep.
So that's an important piece of, again, kind of talking about production and manufacturing and things like that. That's a really really important piece of the puzzle.
Yes. Yeah. And women are really concerned with packaging in all aspects of their lives, really. I had this good friend when I was in the Marine Corps. We'd go out and hit the bars on the weekends, and I one time I was getting ready to go out, and he looks at my shoes and he's like, "Dude, you're gonna go out in those shoes? They're like all dirty and everything like that." I'm like, "Yeah, like who cares? Whatever." He's like, "Do you want to meet women or do you not want to meet women?" I was like, "Well, I want to meet women." He's like, "All right, we're going to the store. You're gonna buy some new shoes." So he had me buy these bright white new shoes. So, I'm kind of thinking this whole time, this is kind of stupid. I'm wasting my money, right? So we go out to this bar and walk in the door. And right next to the door, there's this beautiful girl standing there. She looks down at my shoes. She's like, "Nice shoes." And I was like, "Oh my God, how did, how did I
Oops.
not know this my whole life?" So they do care about packaging.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Men do too.
They do, right? Just not to the same extent, right? So in the branding, the packaging, the storytelling has the massive impact on how well a wine sells. Like my family, my sisters and my parents went over to Italy a month or two ago, and they brought back some wines. And every wine they brought back had a story. Oh yeah, this is they can only do this in this region because the soil is this and that and this and that. And that's the wine people buy, is the ones that have a story behind it.
Absolutely. I mean, the technical term is terroir, and terroir means the loose definition of terroir is the environment with which a grape is grown.
Right.
Okay, that's so terroir refers to, wine is an agricultural product. So you talk about the soil, enormously important, temperature, enormously important, levels of rain, enormously important. I'll give you a perfect example. You have Chile and Argentina in southern South America. Chile is like the Garden of Eden. They can grow anything there. So they actually have to, if you use a horse analogy, they have to actually pull back on the horse. They have to calm down the vineyard because overproduction, if you think of a grape like a sponge, if it fills up with water, it's less concentrated and it's less flavorful, let's say,
Mm-hmm.
in the end product. Whereas right across the Andes, if you look on a map, Chile and Argentina, you think would have very similar climates. In Argentina, it's high desert. They have to feed the vineyard. They have to irrigate. They have to do. It's a totally different way of vineyard management. So that's a perfect example of how you could have two countries and two regions that seemingly seem very close and very similar and have similar cultures, but have a completely different terroir on how they produce wines and different varietals and things like that. And that can even happen. I had a friend who worked for a very, very luxury wine company. And I'm not joking. There was a thing called ancient clay. And from within a 5-foot radius, the soil was completely different. And the guy next door could never figure out why he couldn't make wines of the quality of this other guy, which I won't name, but very, very famous luxury wine. So sometimes, it's not even different countries. It can be across the street, could be completely different.
Right.
And that goes back to your point about storytelling and the magic of wine and why people respond to it so much when they visit the vineyards, because they really get to learn about the different things that go into producing those wines and why. And in particular with European wines, in many cases, they've been doing it for hundreds of years, and they have hundreds of years of trial and error, and which varietals grow better here or which varietals grow better here. France is probably the best example of this, where the regions are very, very specific. If you have Bordeaux, it's Cabernet and Merlot, and a few blending grapes, Petit Verdot, and things like that. If you go, it's really not that far away. You go to Burgundy, it's Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, completely different. Completely different soils, completely different climate. So those are very important factors.
Right. So when you think about the storytelling in wine, when you're maybe promoting a given wine to a distributor or telling a family member about that wine, what one wine comes to mind when you think about good storytelling? Tell me the story.
Oh God. I mean, there's so many. That's kind of a hard question, but I guess a lot of times the site, the actual property, can be something very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
In the south of France, they have a lot of really majestic vineyards and vineyards that you wouldn't even think exist. I mean, in Italy, in the Prosecco region, the real heart of the Prosecco region is called Valdobbiadene, and Valdobbiadene has vineyards that are like, you wonder how they even pick the grapes. I mean, it's literally at a 45-degree or greater angle in the vineyards.
Yep.
So some of those stories can be really, really interesting. But I would just go back to your point. I think that's why vineyards very often are very, very keen on having people come to their vineyard, so they have a captive audience and
Mm-hmm.
they're able to tell their story. And and it's a great opportunity for them to sell them their wines. If I always I have a great friend who sells to cruise lines, and if you think about people, a lot of wineries, many wineries, if not all wineries, want to be on a cruise line. Well, why do they want to be on a cruise line? Because a lot of people will go on that cruise for their honeymoon or for their anniversary, and they'll order a bottle of champagne, and it will create a memory that will last forever. And they will
Mm-hmm.
then go to a store and say, "Oh my God, that's our
Yeah.
wine from our
Yeah.
anniversary," and
Yeah.
da 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 da. And that's a really important piece of brand building. So. And nobody can really tell the story. I can tell a funny story, but nobody can tell the stories about, the properties and the methods and all those type of things better than the people that live there and are in the vineyards every single day,
Sure.
making sure.
Sure.
They also say, I mean, this is a good line, that in good years, in good vintages, I mean, people say, what makes a wine at one vintage better than the other? It's very simple. It's weather.
Right.
If it's hot and it's dry, many times that will contribute to the quality of the wine. If it rains at the worst time or at a terrible time, generally late in the growing season, that can negatively impact the wine.
Right.
So one of the things that winemakers will always say is that in the good years, the wine practically makes itself. When the winemaker really has to get to work is when it's a challenging vintage and they have challenging weather conditions, or it could be anything. It could be a hailstorm. It could be, any number of factors. I mean, anything that could go wrong in the wine business could happen and has happened for sure.
I can't imagine being in that business, honestly. I mean, I'm a gardener. I love growing things. I love growing fruits. I have some fruit trees. I've got a row of Concord grapes, which not great winemaking grapes, but they're fun to eat. But I'll tell you what, man, everything is against you. Everything. If
Absolutely.
it's not the deer, it's the bugs, it's the blight, it's the weather. Like there's just I can't imagine having my my finances dependent on something like that.
I have another good story that you just reminded me of. I was lucky enough to be in France, and we happened to be right near the one of the vineyards for Dom Perignon champagne.
Yep.
And there's a thing called bud break, and that's where the vines, when spring is sprung, essentially.
Right.
And you get bud break, and now okay, the vine is alive, and we're getting ready for that's the very beginning of the growing season. But when you talk about things going wrong, one of the worst things that could happen is you have bud break and then you have a frost, because then that can really negatively impact the vine and the whole thing. Well, being outside this one of the vineyards for DP, um, and they had the frost. It was very cold out, and it seems like an oxymoron, but they sprayed water all over the vineyard. And what that did was the water froze over the buds
Hmm.
and the plants, And in freezing over the plants and the buds, it actually protected them.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to know the guy who invented that, who came up with that idea, because that's, like I said, that seems to go against every, natural way of fixing that problem. But that's another very well-known method of dealing with adversity.
Yeah. No, that's brilliant. Yeah, certainly a lot of challenges in that type of operation. Um, Before I moved on from the storytelling aspect of it, kind of the one point that I wanted to convey in this podcast was that most manufacturers that I'm aware of do not do a good job of telling their story, and they're ultra focused on kind of the technical aspects or the quality aspects or whatever it might be of their product or service. But I see this a lot, like in the machining space. Everyone's like, I'm a precision machine shop, or we're ultra precision machine. It's like everybody's saying that, right? You need something different, right? And so that's really where that storytelling comes in. And there's some elements, thinking about it from a scientific perspective, there's some elements that make a good story that I think manufacturers need to think more about. I read this great book called Stories That Stick by a girl named Kendra Hall. And she named some very specific elements in that book that you need to include in your story. And some of those elements are, number one, you need to have identifiable characters. So your winemaking story might talk about the grandfather who was survived the war and came back and blah 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 blah. And then you need to have authentic emotion, and this is where you kind of inject that drama into the story. When he started his vineyard, his neighbor tried to take away his, whatever. So you're kind of putting yourself in that person's shoes. And then you have a moment. This is when he decided that he needed to make a change, and this is what he did. And then you have the resolution where you kind of go into how he fixed the problem and became the hero of the story. So like those are the types of things that it may be difficult in some of these, what we might think of as sort of dry industries, but every company can come up with a story that they can tell about their brand and about their product that I think is going to help them sell more of it. So I kind of went on a rant there, but that was what I wanted to convey.
No, it's very true. I mean, one of the most popular angles in wine, in particular, is the generational aspect. And as you said, sometimes they'll talk about how their grandfather came back from the war, and he started making wine, for whatever reason, and then passed it along, to the children, and they've had a fell in love with wine and the process. And, I think it's kind of hard not to fall in love with wine and the process if you grow up on a vineyard in Italy. I mean, I think it's kind of easy to say, this isn't too bad, I think it's a lot of hard work, but I think there's also a lot of fun to it. And a lot of, glamour in a lot of ways. But, that's back to the storytelling and the that's really part of the marketability of the wine. How do you do? If you go into a wine store, and some of these wine stores are huge now. They have 1,000 bottles of wine. How do you choose a wine?
Right.
And you can narrow it down. A lot of people can narrow it down based on price, or based on white or red, or what they're eating for dinner, or what they prefer. I mean, there really is no wrong answer, but part of that decision-making process is maybe they read an article about it, in one of the wine publications or something. Yep. So all of those stories is really what it is it's kind of guerrilla marketing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when it's a product, it's a red liquid or a white liquid or clear, there's really not much else to differentiate it on, right? Like if you haven't tried it before, you got to go after the, you have to look at the label in the story. I mean, that's pretty much all you've got, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned something I have on my list to talk about and you used a great word about manufacturing, is precision. And I think that's something that for maybe the layman, they don't factor that in, is to, whether it's a capsule for a wine bottle, or the wine bottle itself, or the cork is a hugely important piece of the puzzle for sure, because that really protects the quality of the wine,
Hmm.
and but then you have the capsule and all those things, and they all have to fit together in a very precise way. And I think that's something, again, back to what I was saying about the winemaker gets a lot of the glory, but I think the production people deserve a lot of credit, because that is not an easy thing to accomplish for sure.
Right.
Because if
Yeah.
it's off, just if a cork is off just a little bit, that could really be a big problem.
Right. Is there a this kind of off topic, is there a difference between, like sometimes you get the obviously synthetic corks and then sometimes you have the real cork material, like is there an advantage to one versus the other?
Not really. The reason that synthetic corks and screw tops, what we call Stelvin enclosures, became popular was the absolute growth, the explosion of growth worldwide of wine.
Hmm.
And there just was not enough cork to satisfy, all that production. And at least in the beginning of my career, there started being substandard corks, and then you would have negative impacts to the wine at times. And the country that really innovated with the Stelvin closure, with the screw, as commonly known as the screw top, was New Zealand. And because of their geographical location and the shipping and the difficulty in getting corks and everything like that, they collectively made a decision of, let's be the pioneers of the screw top. And I'm old enough to remember when people would laugh at a screw top and think that was actually an indicator of
Like a
an
cheap, yeah.
inferior wine,
Yeah.
But in many cases now, and certainly when that was I think the smart thing that New Zealand did was they had screw tops on premium wines, wines that were selling for $30 and $40,
Hmm.
and the consumer of those wines understood why the screw top. You know what I mean. They didn't view it as a negative. They viewed it as a positive. That the wine was actually being protected. In some cases, you have wines that are corked. That's why I was saying about the cork is really one of the most important pieces of the puzzle. If there's a defect in the cork, it will impact the wine, and the wine will become what's known as corked, or there will be some flaw in the wine. When you have a screw top, it really, really minimizes the possibility of flaws to the wine.
Right.
I mean, if you think about it, if one out of every 20 Cokes you opened was flawed, that wouldn't really be an acceptable standard.
Yep.
So wineries have really gotten very, very protective about their enclosures and things like that, because that impacts the wine,
Right.
or could impact the wine. Yeah.
So speaking of impacting the wine, the tariff situation has the potential, and already has impacted, but it has a potential dramatic impact on Italian imports to the U.S. How has that affected your business, and what sort of, I guess, mitigating techniques are you using to kind of control some of the tariff impact? And I noticed that there's kind of this concept, and I'm not exactly sure why, but they say, if things don't settle out by July, it's going to have a really, really bad impact on Italian wine imports to the US. So just talk a little bit about that and how you're dealing with it.
Well, it's a very, very difficult situation. The tariffs are a 10% tariff, which essentially, we're not the type of company that's in a situation that can pass, or that can eat that 10%. We
Right.
have to pass that cost along, in some way, shape, or form to the end consumer.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that we've mitigated that, it's been very, very difficult. I mean, we basically had to redo all of our pricing and all those kind of things. But we've invested more. I mean, I think, we can't invest the whole 10%, but where strategically we feel that it's necessary, or that, the tariff could negatively impact sales or something like that, we basically are put into a situation where we have to invest a little bit more. It's just that simple, you know?
Right. Yeah, and it's not like other types of manufacturing or sourcing where you can say, oh, we can't get it from China anymore. I guess we'll have to go get it from Vietnam. Or, it's like you don't have that option. You're boxed in.
It's funny you bring that up. Another fact is that a lot of the dry goods for the European wineries came from Ukraine. So
Oh,
once the Ukraine-Russia conflict started, that had an impact on getting those supplies from Ukraine, and impact prices and all those kind of things. So it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. If in the wine business, if something can go wrong, it almost certainly will at some
right.
point. Not all at the same time, hopefully, but it's
Yeah,
always
that's
something.
rough. What percentage of your sales are in the US versus the rest of your global market?
So I'm only in the U.S., so I can't really answer that question.
Okay. Okay.
But what I will say is the U.S. is by far our largest single market.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have two potential questions. You can pick whichever one you want. The first one is, when you're looking, selling wine is a very, like you mentioned, a very projection driven scenario. Are there lessons that you've learned in that arena that you feel could have kind of broad application, or lessons that typical manufacturers could take home? And then the second potential question is, with your experience in working with distribution and distributors, what makes a good distributor relationship? And what can manufacturers learn about that interaction?
Well, I think that's, as far as a production standpoint. I mean, with any business to business relationship, and with whatever business that may be, it's many times it's a relationship. The relationship to me is always built on personality for sure, but also doing your job, and following up and making sure that the distributor, for example, when we had to change all of our pricing because of the tariffs, you need to get that pricing to the distributor in a timely fashion so that they can then process that internally, and, then take that to the trade. So, if you don't get them that information, which is obviously, pricing is enormously important in any trade, then you're not being a good partner, and so that would then, tend to negatively impact your relationship with that distributor.
Right.
And if we want to stay on the production side of things, it's back to the precision in production. If you send them a bunch of wine that has bad corks, or has ripped labels, or some kind of defect in some way, shape, or form, or maybe you send them something that, and I'm not saying we ever do this, never, but maybe you send them the wrong product by accident. Someone in the warehouse in Italy makes a mistake and sends them the wrong thing. So from somebody who works in importing and a production type of company, then we would have to make good on that mistake.
Right.
So which is not difficult, but it's you just have to figure it out.
Right.
I think creativity is important in any business. I think the more creative you can be, the more responsive you can be with a distributor, is enormously important to the overall relationship, for sure.
Right. Does your I would imagine that if you, let's say that you ended up with a 50% tariff situation from Italy, and you got to pass that along, right? Would the distributors then say, hey, we don't want the wine, like we can't sell this, we're gonna get something from California to kind of take its place. Does that sort of thing happen, or are there pre-commitments that are there?
Well, I mean, everybody knew about the tariffs in advance.
Right.
And in my particular business, because of the nature of it being an alcoholic product that's very highly regulated, you can't change pricing on a dime. You have to go through a process,
Right.
and then in many cases, they already have inventory that was purchased pre-tariff, let's say. So
Okay.
sometimes you can, that's a perfect example of a word I just used 2 minutes ago was creative. Sometimes you have to really be creative, and that depends a lot of times on your relationship with the distributor and how willing they are to work, well, with you, and maybe they take a bite of the apple, we take a bite of the apple. You try and figure out, because they don't want to lose the business either. you
Right.
know I mean, and certainly in an extreme situation where you would have a 50% tariff, that obviously would change the landscape dramatically.
Mm-hmm.
The 10% tariff is changing the landscape, but it's not irrecoverable.
Right. Yeah.
But 50% would be a different ballgame for sure.
So that 10% that it is now, right? That did not exist a year ago.
Correct.
It was okay. There was nothing. Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah. I'm curious to know. Do you know what tariff they were charging? If we were to send wine to Italy.
I think there's very, very little American wine being consumed in Italy.
Sure.
And the same thing that would
I
go for
can see
France
that.
or Spain or something like that.
Right.
In America,
Those
I believe the
elitist.
last figure that I read was that domestic wines are 70% of the overall business. Um, and another point that I wanted to bring up before we forget, again, back to the production side of it and the packaging side of it, which again, a lot of people don't think about this, is that the bottle and the case, especially in lower priced goods. Higher priced goods is a whole different ballgame. But if you're looking at a lot of mainstream wines, or even call it inexpensive wines, um, the dry goods can end up costing more than the actual liquid.
Right. Right.
Because
Right.
you think about everything that you have to pull together, as I was saying, the bottle and the label and the cork and the capsule and all those things, and the box, the actual case. That's why you see some producers went to box wine. And in some cases, you'd be shocked at the quality of the wine that's in a box wine. And the reason that they're able to sell it so much cheaper is because the dry goods are so much less expensive.
Right. Yeah.
And then you have even something like freight. You think about how heavy a case of wine is. That's
Right.
mainly due to the bottles.
Yeah. The glass. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you find alternate ways of packaging the goods, that can also impact the price.
Right. Yeah. That is an interesting thought too. How in the wine space you're almost forced to look at the packaging and the dry goods side of things, because it's such a high percentage of the overall cost of the product. Where in probably a lot of manufacturing space, the packaging is not as much of a factor in the cost. So you have to be real creative, right, to be able to kind of figure out solutions
For
to that.
sure.
So the box wine, that's a smart way to go.
Yeah.
Pouches and all these other things you see out there.
Exactly. I mean, they have wine on tap. Keg wine.
Right.
So, a lot of that. In beer. That's why a lot of companies really like to push draft beer, because the freight is much less expensive and it's more profitable. They don't have those dry goods, the bottles and the caps and all that kind of thing, and they reuse the kegs. So
Yep.
it's a big pain in the neck, I think, to go back and forth with the kegs. But at the end of the day, it's more profitable than just than selling bottles, depending on the brand, and how quickly it moves.
Right. So we're just about out of time here, but I like to kind of wrap up with a little segment that's kind of what do you need? What kind of resources is your company looking for? Are you personally looking for in the marketplace? Whether it be a supplier or whether it be help with introductions, any sort of thing that you're looking for right now.
I mean, you really want to have good products to sell that are well priced. I think right now with the tariffs and with the economy the way it is, I think everybody's feeling a little bit skittish, and I think there's no question from just about everybody I've spoken to that people have pulled back from luxury wines quite a bit. And again, I'm talking about call it 80% of the population. The rich have gotten richer, and they don't care, so they can still drink whatever they like.
As it
But
goes.
I think for normal people, and even upper middle class people and things like that are watching more than they have necessarily in the past.
Right.
So I think to have good wines that are well priced, and that someone is going to go home, open the bottle, and they're going to say, "Wow, that's delicious. I really enjoyed that." And it's a slow burn, and it's back to what I said before about like guerrilla marketing. It takes a lot of steps, and so really, if you're able to deliver a quality product at a fair price, I think there still is no substitution for that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, John, today. I really enjoyed our chat,
My
and
pleasure.
always fun to learn a little bit more about wine, and especially pretty fascinating import-export world that you're in. So, yeah, thanks for coming on.
My pleasure, Nate. Have a great day.